Ethan Marsh had 10 minutes left to reach the most important interview of his life when the black SUV ahead of him drifted, snapped sideways, and left the highway. He could have kept driving toward the job that would finally pull his family out of debt. Instead, the single father braked hard, went down the embankment, and dragged an unconscious woman out of a smoking wreck. He kept her breathing until the ambulance came, and watched his last chance leave with it. Hours later, Diane Bennett, chief executive of Bennett Halcyon Systems, woke holding a rejected applicant file marked with 2 words, former SEAL. Ethan Marsh woke before the sun in a small house at the edge of Millbrook, a town most people only ever drove through. The suit was already laid out on the kitchen table, taken in at the shoulders by his daughter the night before, because it had been bought for a younger and heavier man. The position was Director of Crisis Response at Bennett Halcyon Systems, and it was not an ordinary job. He had passed 4 rounds of assessment to become one of 2 finalists, and the salary would have erased his daughter's tuition loan and ended a long chain of temporary contracts. More than the money, it was the first time in years a serious company had looked at what he could do instead of at the gaps in his history. He had prepared quietly and completely, and he had said nothing to Mia about how frightened he was. When she called at 6 from her dorm, he told her it was only an interview, and she told him it was only a formality, and neither statement was true. Ethan had a habit of shrinking large things to a manageable size before handing them to other people, and it had made him a good leader once, and a difficult man to help ever since. He stood in the doorway of an empty house a moment longer than he needed to, thinking about his wife, gone 3 years now, who would have made a joke about the tie. The drive took him along the Ashford Bay Coastal Highway, where the morning fog had not yet burned off the guardrails. Ethan drove in the right lane, eyes moving in a pattern drilled into him so long ago it no longer felt like training. That was how he noticed the black SUV 200 feet ahead of him. Its brake lights flared bright and steady, but the vehicle did not slow, and that mismatch between signal and behavior set something cold and familiar loose in his chest. The rear wheel shuddered in a rhythm he had seen twice before, both times in vehicles whose stability systems had stopped talking to their brakes. The SUV crossed 2 lanes in under 4 seconds, clipped the median, went light on its suspension, and slid down the far embankment into a stand of scrub pine with a sound like a dropped safe. Ethan looked at the dashboard clock, 10 minutes left, and the interview was 19 miles ahead. 3 cars slowed. None stopped. Then he saw the hand. Pale and open against the inside of the driver's window, striking the glass twice with almost no force, the way a hand moves when the person attached to it is already losing the argument with their own body. Smoke lifted from the seam of the hood. Ethan pulled onto the shoulder and did not look at the clock again. He stripped off his tie and threw it on the seat with his phone and the folder holding every copy of his resume. He grabbed the window punch and the shears he had carried in every vehicle he'd owned since he was 24, and went down the embankment. Nothing he did in the next 11 minutes looked heroic from the outside. He circled the wreck once before touching it, because the first thing you learn about a crash is that it can still kill you. He noted the faint fuel smell, the thin electrical crackle beneath the dash, and the way the driver's door had folded at the hinge and would not open without hydraulic tools. He reached through the shattered rear glass, found the emergency cutoff behind the console panel, and killed the electrical system, buying whatever margin he was going to get. Then he punched the window at the lower corner, cleared the glass with his jacket-wrapped forearm, and looked at the woman inside. She was in her late 30s, dark hair matted at the temple, pinned by a locked belt and a knee wedged under a deformed section of the dash. Her breathing was shallow and getting shallower. Ethan talked to her in short, flat sentences, because long sentences require a listener, and she didn't have one to spare. He held her head in line with her spine with one hand and cut the belt with the other, then waited, because moving her too fast would have been the thing that hurt her, not the crash. When her leg came free, he brought her out through the window and laid her on his folded jacket in the wet grass, clear of the smoke. He kept her talking, checked her pupils, found the pulse at her throat when her wrist got hard to read, and tipped her head to keep her airway open when her breathing began to whistle. The ambulance took 19 minutes, not long, unless you're counting them one at a time with your fingers on someone's artery. At some point her eyes tracked past his face to a laminated visitor pass that had slipped from the folder, and she saw the name printed on it before her eyes rolled back. When the medics arrived, one asked why he was wearing a suit. Ethan checked his watch, saw his interview had begun 22 minutes ago, and said he had somewhere to be. They asked about his training. He said he knew some first aid, technically true, and he'd been telling that particular lie for 8 years. He gave a statement to a trooper, declined to be checked out, and climbed back to his truck with mud to the knee, a torn sleeve, and blood on his cuff that wasn't his own. Then he drove the 19 miles to Bennett Halcyon Systems anyway, because a stubborn and unfashionable belief still lived in him that if you explain yourself honestly, reasonable people will listen. The lobby was glass and pale stone, faintly scented with cut flowers. The receptionist looked at Ethan the way you look at weather rolling in over a picnic. He gave his name, said he'd been in an accident, and asked whether the interview panel might still be available. She made 2 calls with her hand cupped around the receiver. What arrived wasn't the panel, it was Renata Cole, Chief People Officer, in a cream jacket, 3 managers trailing behind her, clearly told there was something worth seeing. Renata looked him over, from the mud on his shoes to the torn shoulder seam, then asked, in a voice pitched to carry across the lobby, whether he understood what the word punctual meant. Ethan didn't perform the story. He said there'd been a wreck on the highway, that a woman had been trapped, and that he'd stopped because he couldn't leave her there. He didn't mention cutting her free, carrying her, or keeping her breathing for 19 minutes. He offered the trooper's name and badge number. Renata smiled the way people smile when they've already decided how a thing is going to end. She said the company was hiring a director of crisis response, and that she found it instructive that a candidate for the role couldn't manage the crisis of his own calendar. One of the managers behind her laughed, then looked at the floor. She informed him the position had gone that morning to the other finalist, a young man whose family had known Marissa Voss for years. Ethan asked for 5 minutes. He didn't ask twice. In front of the desk staff and a dozen people waiting for elevators, Renata told him the company needed leadership, not men who showed up late with heroic stories hoping someone would feel sorry for them. Ethan stood very still. Later, several people in that lobby would describe the stillness and none could explain why it made them uncomfortable. He thanked her for her time, which cost him something, then walked out and sat in his truck with his hands on the wheel. He didn't call Mia. He drove home, changed, went to the warehouse where he'd been picking up night shifts, and asked for a double to cover the wages he'd lost. 19 miles away, in a private hospital owned by Bennett Halcyon Systems, a medic emptying a folded jacket found a leather folder with a name printed on the applicant tab, Ethan Marsh. Diane Bennett surfaced a little after 4 in the afternoon with a headache like a struck bell and 11 staples in her scalp. Her chief of staff told the story in the flat, careful voice people use around executives who nearly died, a loss of vehicle control, a rollover, a fire that never quite started, and a man who'd cut her free and carried her clear. She asked who he was, and nobody could tell her much beyond a name and a trooper's report. She asked whether anyone had thanked him, and the silence that followed answered more completely than words would have. Then her assistant set a folder on the tray table, and Diane recognized the recruiting logo before anything else, because she'd approved that logo herself 2 years earlier. It was one of her own company's applicant files. She turned it over with fingers that didn't want to cooperate and found the name Ethan Marsh and a disposition stamp entered at 11 that morning, withdrawn from consideration, unprofessional conduct. She called the people office from her hospital bed and studied the incident summary Renata Cole had written while Diane was still unconscious 3 floors below. The summary described a candidate who arrived nearly an hour late, disheveled, argumentative, demanding accommodation. It used the phrase poor judgment under pressure, which Diane read 4 times, sitting in a hospital gown with a line in her arm, having been carried up an embankment by the man the sentence was about. She'd built a company on the premise that documents were reliable and people were not. She was beginning to understand that a document is only ever as reliable as whoever holds the pen. She asked for his full application, unabridged. The military section was 4 lines long: 12 years of service, specialization in personnel recovery, reconnaissance, and crisis response, a decoration for actions during a rescue operation listed without the citation, honorable discharge. He'd been a Navy SEAL and had written about it the way another man might list a summer job: no photograph, no reference letter, no attempt to make the point louder. Diane had spent her adult life among people who inflated their credentials into architecture, and here was a man who had folded his into a paragraph and left it in a drawer. What stayed with her wasn't the record. It was that he'd knelt in the mud beside a stranger for 19 minutes and told the medics he knew some first aid. It was that he'd walked into her lobby covered in her blood and never once said the word seal, not when it would have won him the interview, not when it would have won him an apology. He'd let Renata Cole humiliate him rather than use a medal as a bargaining chip. Diane Bennett, who evaluated human beings by school, network, and title, and who was very good at it, understood from a hospital bed that her entire instrument was calibrated wrong. She called Renata directly. Renata was smooth and immediate. The man might well have exaggerated, she said, since it was a remarkable coincidence that a candidate for a crisis role should happen upon a crisis involving the chief executive on the morning of his own interview. It was, Diane admitted, a remarkable coincidence. She asked for the lobby footage. Renata said the system retained recordings for only 72 hours and that she'd look into it, and something in the smoothness of that answer stayed lodged in Diane like a splinter. Marissa Voss arrived at 7 with white orchids and a face arranged into precisely the correct proportion of concern. She said all the right things, and then, around the 9th minute, produced a folder of her own and suggested that, given the concussion and the doctor's caution about cognitive load, Diane might sign a limited proxy for the board session that week. A formality, she called it. When Diane asked about the man who'd pulled her out, Marissa's face changed by perhaps 2%, and she said it was unfortunate how often unemployed veterans found ways to attach themselves to wealthy people. Diane did not sign the proxy. After Marissa left, Diane asked for two things: the telemetry from her vehicle and the security schedule governing her transportation. The telemetry came back with a gap. The event data module, which Bennett Halcyon Systems itself manufactured, designed to survive a rollover and a fire, had returned an empty block for the 90 seconds surrounding the crash. The schedule showed her driver released the previous evening and her route revised at 11:40 that night by someone with administrative authority, which was how a woman who hadn't driven herself to work in 4 years ended up alone behind the wheel. Diane sat with the folder in her lap for a long time. When her chief of staff asked whether she wanted Ethan Marsh restored to the candidate list, she said the sentence that changed everything that followed: "Do not offer that man a job. First, find out who put my vehicle off the road." When the company's people drove to Ethan's address the next morning, he wasn't home. He was 6 hours into a 12-hour shift moving pallets in a warehouse 40 minutes inland, making back the wages he'd lost going to an interview he'd never been allowed to attend. Diane went to the warehouse herself at 9 that night, against medical advice and against the advice of everyone she employed. She waited by the loading bay with a scarf over her staples, and when Ethan came out on break, he recognized her immediately and said nothing about it. She thanked him. He said she was welcome. Then she offered him a check that would have cleared Mia's tuition loan twice over, and he didn't take it. The refusal was so mild and so complete that she found herself off balance for the first time in years. He told her he'd stopped because stopping was the thing to do, not because it was an invoice. She said she wanted to reopen the interview. Ethan asked the question she'd think about for months afterward: whether she actually believed he was the right person for the role, or whether she simply felt indebted, because those two things looked identical from the outside and only one of them was worth anything. Diane was used to gratitude arriving on schedule. She heard herself get defensive, heard him decline the bait, and understood in a warehouse parking lot that this man had assessed her more accurately in 11 minutes than most of her board had in 6 years. So instead of answering, she asked what he'd seen at the crash. He told her, in order, without embellishment. The brake lights had been illuminated while the vehicle failed to decelerate, meaning the pedal command and braking system were no longer in agreement. The electronic door releases had locked instead of unlatching after impact, the opposite of the design behavior. The automatic collision notification had never transmitted, though the antenna was intact. And there'd been a faint chemical smell near the lower console he associated with an overheated aftermarket relay. Any one of those, he said, was a bad day. All four at once was a decision. Diane offered him a 48-hour engagement as an independent advisor, and Ethan accepted with 3 conditions, stated once, not negotiated. First, that his data access be lawful and documented, because he had no intention of building a case a lawyer could set on fire. Second, that every finding go simultaneously to an outside auditor, so nothing he discovered could live or die inside the company that might be responsible for it. Third, that she never use his service record as marketing. Diane agreed to all three and privately noted that the third had come out fastest. Bennett Halcyon Systems received him the following morning with a visitor badge and an escort. Renata Cole intercepted him in the corridor and said, with a warmth that fooled nobody, that he shouldn't confuse a chief executive's gratitude with an assessment of his leadership. Ethan said he'd never confuse the two, and that she should be careful not to confuse a personnel file with a person. Marissa Voss was friendlier. She found him 3 times that day, always in passing, and each conversation curved toward the same place. What had he seen at the scene? Had he touched the console? Had anyone else been down the embankment with him? By the second afternoon, Ethan had stopped answering her and started watching her. She never asked how Diane was. She never asked how he'd gotten the door open or whether the fire had been closed. The 2 questions everyone else in the building had asked within 90 seconds of meeting him. She wasn't interested in the rescue. She was interested in the evidence. When Ethan got into the maintenance telemetry with the vendor's cooperation and assigned access order, he found what she was worried about. A remote service command pushed to the vehicle 17 minutes before the crash, disabling the stability arbitration and the post-impact unlock sequence, authorized through an account on the executive floor. He sat with that in a borrowed conference room, watching the timestamp blink, and understood everything he thought he was doing had changed shape. He believed he was helping a company find an outside attacker. He was standing inside a building with the person who had done it. Whoever sent that instruction knew the vehicle architecture intimately, held administrative privilege, and had 17 minutes of foresight. That narrowed the field to fewer than 9 people, and of those 9, only one had spent 2 days asking a stranger what he'd seen. Marissa Voss did not panic, because Marissa Voss had never panicked in her life. She was 47, third generation of a family that had made its money in private capital, and she'd learned before she was 20 that you don't fight an opponent, you rearrange the ground beneath him. 2 days later, an anonymous message appeared on the company's internal network, addressed to all staff, expressing concern about the outside advisor walking the executive floor. It noted he'd departed a military assignment following a conflict with a senior officer, used the words unstable, difficult to control, and refused a lawful instruction. It alleged nothing specific and was, in the way of such things, entirely unanswerable. Renata Cole summoned him that same morning, with a note-taker present, and asked whether he had any psychological conditions that might render his conduct unpredictable in a corporate environment. She asked it gently, which made it worse. Ethan sat with his hands flat on the table and recognized the machinery for what it was, because he'd watched it operate on other men. You don't have to prove a veteran is dangerous. You only have to raise the possibility and let everyone finish the sentence privately. 12 years of service reduced to a rumor about a temper. He answered every question briefly and truthfully, then asked for a copy of the record, which he was told he'd receive and never did. The truth about his last deployment was smaller and less dramatic than the message implied, which is generally the case. A defense contractor had supplied tactical communication units with a firmware defect that caused them to drop encryption under thermal load. Ethan had documented it, reported it, and been told to keep using them. During an extraction, 3 units failed within 4 minutes of one another, and 2 men were badly hurt in the confusion that followed. Afterward, a senior officer with a career to protect asked him to sign a report attributing the failure to operator error by the team on the ground. He'd raised his voice exactly once in 12 years, and that had been the occasion. He refused to sign, submitted his own report instead with the firmware logs attached, and protected 4 subordinates who would otherwise have carried the blame for a defect that had been known and ignored. There was no disciplinary action because there was nothing to discipline. Simply, from that week forward, a permanent absence of opportunity, and eventually an honorable discharge into a civilian market where the same contractor sat on the boards of 6 companies that never quite had a role for him. He'd never made any of it public, because half the file involved other men's names, and their careers weren't his to spend. Marissa moved before he could finish. She convened the executive committee and, with a great show of reluctance, raised her concern that a chief executive who hands an internal security investigation to the man who rescued her isn't an executive making a decision, she's a patient making an attachment. Walter Kingston, 63 and chairman since before half the room had graduated, asked one question: whether any of this could reach the press. told that it could, he directed that the advisory engagement be terminated immediately. Diane objected. She was steady for 4 minutes. Then Marissa produced a document, a summary of a formal complaint from a naval officer describing a subordinate who'd shouted at him during a review of an operational incident. It was real. It was also 9 years old, 4 paragraphs long, and stripped of every piece of context that made it comprehensible. In the silence that followed, Ethan heard something enter Diane's voice that he'd heard in other rooms from other people about to do the convenient thing, a small hesitation, a half-second of recalculation, the sound of someone deciding to ask him to explain himself. He didn't let her finish the question. He stood, took the visitor badge off his lanyard, and set it on the table in front of her. He said evenly that she couldn't ask a man to find the truth and treat him as the suspect every time the truth became inconvenient, and that she should decide which of those two things she actually wanted, because he'd spent 8 years being useful to institutions that wanted both. He thanked the committee for its time and walked out through a room of people who didn't look up. But before he left the building, from a chair in the lobby, Ethan sent Diane a single encrypted file. It contained the maintenance chain of custody he'd assembled over 4 days. The servicing of her vehicle had been subcontracted through 2 intermediaries to a firm incorporated 14 months earlier whose sole funding came from a holding company sharing a registered agent with Ironvale Capital. Ironvale had spent 9 months trying to acquire Bennett Halcyon's emergency response division at a valuation the market considered indecent, and Diane was the vote standing in the way. That night, at 11 minutes past 2 in the morning, an alert reached her phone. The original telemetry archive was being purged, and the request had originated inside the company. She got out of bed and worked until dawn alone, his file open on one screen, the audit trail on the other. Somewhere around 4 in the morning she found the thing that reframed the entire week. Ethan had, on his second day, generated 3 versions of his preliminary findings, each naming a slightly different physical location for the vehicle's backup data module, and routed one to the security group, one to legal, and one to the chief operating officer's office. The deletion sweep that ran that night had targeted precisely and only the location named in the version that had gone to Marissa Voss. It wasn't proof. Ethan had written exactly that at the bottom of the file, in the plain style he used for everything. This is a directional indicator, not a conclusion, and it must be validated by an independent party. But it meant the leak had a single address, and it meant the man they'd thrown out of the building had anticipated being thrown out, had built a test that would keep working after he was gone, and had preserved every bit of it beyond the company's reach so she could continue without him. He hadn't left her a weapon. He'd left her a map, and no bill. She found him the next evening at his house, small, clean, a photograph of a woman in a hospital scarf on the hallway wall. She apologized, not with a settlement but with the sentence she owed him, that she'd let a room full of powerful people turn 12 years of his service into a reason to doubt his character, and that she'd hesitated when she shouldn't have. Ethan didn't accept it easily, which she respected more than she expected to. He said it wasn't the first time he'd watched people praise a veteran's service at a podium in the morning and use it against him in a conference room by the afternoon. Then Mia called, and Ethan took it in the kitchen. She was 19, studying biomedical engineering 4 hours north, and someone in her cohort had found the anonymous message and passed it around. She wasn't upset for herself. She was upset that her father's name was being handled by people who'd never met him. Ethan told her, with his back to the doorway where Diane could hear him, that he was going to step away from the whole thing, because a job was a job and she was his daughter, and the arithmetic wasn't difficult. Mia said no. She reminded him, in the direct way she'd inherited from her mother, that he'd raised her on one rule above all others, that you don't stay quiet when you know somebody is in danger. And that she wasn't going to be the reason he broke it. She said she could survive some talk, and asked whether the woman in that vehicle could survive the next attempt. Ethan stood in his own kitchen with no answer, and his 19-year-old daughter hung up on him gently, the way she did when she knew she'd won. Diane offered immediately to have Mia's personal information protected and every reference to her removed from company systems. Ethan said that wasn't enough. This was the moment Diane understood what kind of man had been in front of her all along. He didn't want a shield for his own family. He wanted a policy, written protection for every employee at Bennett Halcyon Systems who reported wrongdoing and was punished for it, enforced by a body that didn't report to the chief operating officer. If she wanted him back, it wouldn't be as a favor between two people. It would be with the structure changed underneath him. Diane signed the charter for an independent audit group at 7 the following morning, with outside counsel as its chair and a direct line to the ethics committee of the board. Ethan returned, and he returned differently: no visitor badge, no informal arrangement, no gratitude economy. He had a written mandate, a defined scope, and an obligation to report findings whether or not the chief executive liked them. Within 3 days, working alongside 2 forensic accountants and a vehicle systems engineer, the group established the sequence. Marissa Voss's credentials had revised Diane's route and released her security driver at 11:40 the night before the crash, 16 minutes after her badge last opened her own office door. The intent was never necessarily to kill her, which was in some ways the coldest part of it. A dead chief executive triggers investigations, insurance forensics, and federal interest, and injured one triggers a medical leave. Marissa had needed Diane absent or discredited for roughly 3 weeks, the window required for the board to approve the Iron Veil transaction and for a personal position held through a family vehicle to convert into something in the range of $90 million. She hadn't gambled with Diane's life so much as budgeted for it. That Thursday, notice went out that the board session had been advanced to 9 the next morning, with the acquisition vote as the second item. The session was held in the main atrium rather than the boardroom, which told Ethan everything about how it was meant to go. Marissa had invited major shareholders, outside counsel, 2 members of the Iron Veil partnership, and enough staff to fill the gallery. She opened not with the transaction but with concern, which was always her opening. She spoke for 6 minutes about her admiration for Diane, about the difficulty of recovery from head trauma, and about her duty to raise the question of whether a chief executive who'd handed an internal investigation to the man who rescued her was exercising sound judgment or something more human and less appropriate. Ethan had been summoned as a witness. He understood within 90 seconds he'd been summoned as an exhibit. Renata Cole took the floor and put an image on the atrium screens, security footage of a man in a ruined suit standing in the lobby, mud to the knee, sleeve torn, a dark stain on his cuff, arguing with the head of the people function. She read her amended incident summary aloud, describing a candidate who'd arrived an hour late, behaved aggressively, and demanded preferential treatment. Somebody in the gallery laughed at the image. Ethan looked at the blood on his own cuff and thought about how few people in that room knew whose it was. Then Marissa turned to him with an expression of gentle curiosity and asked the question she'd been saving for 11 days. "You were a SEAL," she said, 12 years, a decoration, a specialty in rescue, so explain to this room why a man with that record is currently working night shifts moving boxes in a warehouse." It required no accusation. It simply invited 200 people to complete a syllogism whose conclusion was that excellent men don't end up in warehouses, and therefore nothing he'd found was worth opening. Ethan stood up. He said that after his discharge, his wife had been diagnosed with an illness that took 4 years to kill her, and that during those 4 years he'd turned down every position requiring travel because there'd been a girl who needed one parent in the house at night. He said he'd taken contract work because contract work let him be at the hospital on Tuesdays. He said he didn't consider any of that a failure, and that anyone who believed a man's worth could be measured by the ceiling of his last job title had never needed somebody to stop for them on the side of a road. The atrium was very quiet. Marissa pivoted without a flicker. She suggested the entire rescue was more convenient than credible. That a man who'd failed to secure the role had encountered the chief executive in extremis on the very morning of his own interview, and that the coincidence had been engineered rather than endured. Walter Kingston, who wanted only for this to stop existing before the markets opened, asked security to escort the advisor out. 2 officers moved along the gallery wall. Ethan didn't resist, because resisting was what they wanted on camera, and because he'd understood for 3 days exactly how this room was going to behave. He walked to the long table and set down a small memory card in a sealed evidence sleeve, signed and countersigned by the vehicle systems vendor and a partner from the outside audit firm. He said, loud enough for the gallery, that they could remove him from the building, but they couldn't remove a timestamp. Marissa said the card represented an unverified security risk and directed that it not be opened. And it was into that exact silence that the atrium doors opened and Diane Bennett walked in, 11 staples in her scalp, discharged against medical advice 90 minutes earlier, outside counsel on one side of her and the chair of the audit group on the other. She didn't raise her voice. She said the man standing by the door wasn't the subject of any investigation at the company. The subject of the investigation was the chief operating officer. The scope had been authorized in writing on Monday, and the findings were now before the board. Marissa absorbed this without a single change of expression, then smiled and said she appreciated Diane's theatrics, but that she'd spent the last 4 days securing commitments and now held enough votes to remove her from the chief executive's chair before lunch. She laid her proxies on the table like a winning hand, and for perhaps 90 seconds the room belonged to her. Diane didn't argue with any of it. She simply asked that the sealed card be opened in front of outside counsel, the audit chair, and the partner who'd signed the chain of custody. Walter Kingston, who was many things but not stupid, realized that refusing that request in front of 200 witnesses would end his own career instead of somebody else's. The card went into a laptop that had never touched the company network. The atrium screens changed, and the room began, very slowly, to turn. The remote service instruction that had disabled the stability arbitration and the post-impact door release had been authorized at 8:19 that morning from a terminal registered to the office of the chief operating officer. Diane's route revision and the release of her security driver had been executed the previous night under Marissa Voss's own credentials. The automatic collision notification had been suppressed by a configuration change bundled into the same package. The firm that serviced the vehicle had received 4 payments totaling $640,000 from a company sharing a registered agent with an Iron Veil holding entity. And the last item on the screen was a revision history showing that Renata Cole had edited Ethan Marsh's interview record at 4:11 in the afternoon, 40 minutes after learning who the woman on the embankment had been. Marissa said calmly that her credentials had evidently been compromised and that the timing suggested a deliberate frame. It was a good answer. It was very nearly good enough. That was when Ethan, still standing near the doors between 2 security officers, asked whether the board would like to test it. He explained the 3 versions, 3 preliminary summaries, 3 offices, each naming a different physical location for the backup module, only one of them fictional. That fictional address had gone to the office of the chief operating officer and nowhere else. 2 employees of an Iron Veil affiliate had been recorded by a municipal traffic camera at that address the next morning, trying to open a storage unit that contained nothing at all. It wasn't a stolen credential. A stolen credential doesn't send men to an address that exists only inside one specific version of one specific document. Renata Cole stood up too quickly and began explaining that she'd edited the interview record at Marissa's instruction, that she'd been told the candidate was a liability, that she'd known nothing about a vehicle. The revision log still on the screens behind her showed her account making the changes, and her account alone. 2 board members who'd signed Marissa's proxies that morning quietly asked for them to be withdrawn from the record. Diane spoke once more, only to close the exit. Certified copies of the complete evidence file, she said, had been delivered to the outside auditor, to the company's securities counsel, and to the appropriate authorities at 6 that morning, 3 hours before the session opened. Nothing on the screens existed solely within Bennett Halcyon systems. No administrative privilege inside the building could reach it. Walter Kingston, who'd spent 30 years choosing stability over conscience and had just watched that trade fail publicly, suspended the chief operating officer, voided the acquisition vote, and referred the matter to a special committee in that order, in under 2 minutes. There was no violence, and nobody was dragged out. Marissa Voss's access was revoked from a terminal at the front desk while she was still walking toward it, and she was escorted from the atrium through a corridor lined with people who'd been on her side an hour earlier and now found other places to look. At the door she stopped in front of Ethan and, for the first time, showed a hairline crack. "You only won," she said, "because you happened to be in the right place at the right time." Ethan looked at her for a moment. "I was in the right place," he said, "because you built your entire plan on the belief that nobody would stop." And the room understood all at once what her actual mistake had been. She'd chosen that stretch of highway, that hour, that vehicle, on the assumption that everyone is selfish, that a man 10 minutes from the interview of his life would keep driving, and that a woman trapped behind a locked door would be found by paramedics rather than by a stranger with a window punch. Her plan had been sound, and it failed on one unmodeled variable. Afterward, in a smaller room, Diane offered Ethan the position of Director of Crisis Response on the spot, at the compensation originally posted. He didn't take it. She'd expected almost any response except that one. He said the search had been corrupted before he'd ever walked into the building, and that if she simply handed him the job now, every person at Bennett Halcyon Systems would be entitled to believe he'd been paid for a rescue, and they'd be right, and he'd spend 5 years managing that suspicion instead of managing emergencies. He'd watched what a rumor could do to a man's work. He wasn't going to build a department on one. The second interview lasted 3 hours. Ethan spoke about his service record for perhaps 4 minutes of it, because the record was context, not an argument. The rest was a plan: separate the security and emergency functions from the operating officer's reporting line entirely, so no single executive could ever again both create an incident and control its investigation, mirror all critical telemetry to an external escrow, codify protection for employees who report wrongdoing, with an appeals path outside the people function, and build every emergency procedure so it still works when the executive floor is unreachable, unavailable, or compromised, because in his experience the executive floor was frequently all three. The panel understood by the end that they weren't choosing him because he'd been a SEAL. They were choosing him because he was the only candidate in the room who'd thought seriously about what happens to an organization when its most powerful person is the problem, and who designed a system that didn't depend on any individual being trustworthy. The vote was recorded, published internally, and unanimous. On a Thursday morning in the company auditorium, Diane Bennett handed Ethan Marsh a permanent badge, and the man who'd been told he couldn't manage his own schedule took authority over every emergency operation the corporation ran on 3 continents. He didn't use it to settle anything. 2 of the managers who'd laughed in the lobby that morning still worked in his reporting line, and he never mentioned it. One of them eventually apologized in a hallway, and Ethan told him it was fine and meant it. What he did instead was insist that the standards apply to everyone, including the chief executive, who discovered in her second month that she was expected to complete the same emergency certification as a warehouse supervisor, and who complained about it, and who completed it. That was the shape of his victory, and it was why it mattered. He'd walked into a world of powerful people without becoming another version of them. 6 months later, the special committee published its findings. Marissa Voss had manipulated vehicle service systems, altered executive movement schedules, and coordinated with Ironvale Capital to depress the valuation of a division she stood to profit from personally. The legal process moved forward the way such processes do, slowly, and in paperwork. Renata Cole was terminated for cause over the falsified records. The Ironvale transaction was abandoned. 4 board members did not stand for re-election, and Walter Kingston retired in the spring with a statement about changing times that fooled nobody and offended no one. Bennett Halcyon Systems adopted every one of Ethan's proposals, including the ones that made its executives uncomfortable, which were the ones that mattered. Mia came down for the first full-scale emergency exercise her father directed and stood at the back of a control room watching 140 people move on his instructions, with the same unhurried voice he'd used to talk her through a broken arm when she was 8. It was long enough to see her father finally recognized without having traded away a single thing to get there. On the drive back to the train, she told him she was proud of him, and he changed the subject, and she let him. He kept the truck. He kept the house. The new title didn't put distance between him and his daughter, and it didn't turn him into a man who mentioned his service record at parties, because he'd never been that man, and a promotion is not a personality. Diane changed too, more slowly and more visibly. She stopped treating authority as evidence that she was correct. She started asking the second question instead of accepting the first answer, and she developed a habit, alarming to her staff, of walking down to the loading dock and talking to people whose names had never appeared in any file she'd ever opened. What grew between them was not gratitude, which is a debt, and not romance, which would have been cheap. It was respect, which takes longer and holds better. They disagreed constantly and professionally about budgets and staffing, and how much risk a company may accept on behalf of people who never voted for it. The difference was that Diane no longer used her position to end a disagreement, and Ethan no longer assumed that a person with power was necessarily performing. One evening in October, after a night exercise ran long and the control room emptied out, she asked the question she'd been carrying since the warehouse parking lot. Why he hadn't simply kept driving that morning. He thought about it a while before answering, which was one of the things she'd come to like about him. He said he'd spent 12 years in places where people died in the 4 minutes between somebody noticing a problem and somebody deciding it was theirs. He said the most dangerous assumption in the world is that another person will stop. Diane said quietly that he'd lost a job that day because of her. Ethan shook his head and told her no. He'd lost an interview, not a job, and that any job worth having had to belong to the man he actually was, not to the man he'd have had to become to arrive on time. She asked him to get a cup of coffee. She said, with unusual care, that it wasn't a meeting, that it wasn't an offer from a chief executive, and that he was welcome to say no without anything at all happening to his position. Ethan smiled, which he didn't do often, and said yes. That was as far as it went that autumn, and neither of them was in any hurry, and that was rather the point. The last thing to say is about a stretch of coastal highway 19 miles from the Bennett Halcyon campus, where a black SUV once left the road on a foggy morning and 3 cars slowed and none of them stopped. There is a rapid response beacon system on that curve now, funded by the company and designed by the department Ethan runs, and it has been activated 11 times in its first year. And in the training center where every new employee begins, above the console at the front of the room, there is a single sentence the first principal Ethan Marsh wrote into the curriculum. In a crisis, it says, a title has never saved anyone. Only a choice can do that.